Morning. Oh, okay, I gotta be here.
I'm always like, okay.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, all right, thanks. So stick around here then. All right. Wow, the room is filling. Great. All right.
Hi, sorry about that. So welcome everyone. This is our fall sociology speaker series, and I'm Jennifer Puentes, one of the sociology professors here, but this is kind of a collaborative effort. We have Dr. Gowerty's class, we have Dustin Ellis's class. I know Heather Tomlinson was sending some folks, and it's also open to the community, so it's okay. People are going to trickle in. Just find a spot. You're good. I want to go ahead and I'm pleased to introduce Dwayne Plaza, professor of sociology in the School of Public Policy at Oregon State University. Dr. Plaza recently served as the president of the Pacific Sociological Association. He has been at Oregon State University for 28 years.
Yeah, a long time.
And teaches a wide slate of classes, both at the undergraduate and graduate levels. He's written extensively on the topic of Caribbean migration within international diaspora, gender and STEM education, critical pedagogy, and ethnic relations in Canada. For today's talk, we have about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Please wait for the microphone so people on the live stream can hear. I'll just kind of come around, raise your hand, I can come around. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. And for those that end class at 10:50, it's okay if you have to check out and you walk. It's okay. We won't be offended. We understand. If others need to sit and talk a little bit more, we can totally do that. I want to turn it over to Dr. Plaza for his presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Puentes. So I'm really happy to be here. It's actually my third time on your campus over the 27 years that I've been in Oregon, and came through to have meetings here. I've never really stayed very much, but I find it such a beautiful space, and you're all lucky to be in a place where you can actually have some great faculty and great opportunities to learn. I'm going to start off with this Mentimeter poll real quick. Unfortunately, people online can't see it, but you all can, so I'm going to say the first thing that's really helpful for me to see is that there's just about 5 somewhat happy people, right? Most of you are clearly happy, which is a great thing. And so we'll carry on with the next question. Let's make this happen. So we'll go to the next slide. Next question. What's been a happy moment for you in 2025? That's my student from the University of Oregon. Kat is actually riding the pig up at Seattle. I actually teach a number of students from University of Oregon, OSU, and University of Washington. We have a consortium of students. Unfortunately, it's really bright. You can't see Kat's smiling face. But for you, what's been something good for you in 2025? Just trying to break the ice here, trying to figure out if we can get you to start telling me something about yourselves. Okay, someone plays volleyball. Great. What else is going on that makes you happy? It's been a hard time to be happy these days, but some of us are finding happiness. Okay, motorcycle, reunion with friends at La Grande, hunting with dad, playing a sport I love. What's a sport you love? Who's that? These are all anonymous. I can never tell who said whatever. Who's playing a sport they love? What are you playing? Volleyball. Volleyball. There's a big tournament on this weekend, isn't there? In town. I didn't know there's a big sign up. So is it various universities coming to town?
No, it's like
high school. Oh, okay, yeah. We have a pretty good team this year. I don't know if you're following Oregon State University's team. I think they're doing pretty well. And of course, the U of O does really well too. Yeah, yeah. So how does Eastern do?
really good.
Really good too? All right, great. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next question. Keep these pretty fast. Unfortunately, I can't go through everybody's because we only have 45 minutes, and this is really about breaking the ice. If you had a magic wand, what would your dream job be in the next 5 years? Okay, I want to see what you would like to be. In other words, you got a degree. It's in your hands. 5 years from now, what do you want to be? I see teachers. Okay, writers. So I've had some really funny ones that students have put up here, like influencer, rich, fashion designer, great, marine biologist, All right, who wants to be a barrel racer? I want to find about that one. All right, what's a barrel racer? You mean with horses?
Yeah.
All right.
That's just, yeah, it's a side dream. I would become a teacher, but
All right, well, that's great. Sports agents, social workers, attorneys, a lot of lawyers, and teachers. Great. Okay, great. So we've got a pretty diverse room of people here wanting to be all sorts of things with their degree. Who wants to be the forensic anthropologist? Forensic anthropologist. Someone put that in. Yeah, all right. That's an interesting profession. Okay, now we're starting to get serious in the presentation. Give me examples of where you've witnessed or experienced bias. Give me examples where you've experienced or witnessed bias. So if you're just joining us, just person next to you probably knows with the instructions, and they'll tell you what's going on. Okay, so we see bias in news channels. Good. Where else? News articles, conversations, social media, in my community. Where else have you seen bias? These are all valid answers. Fellow students, what about getting jobs? What about getting to school? In classrooms, with faculty, with teachers, probably. Workplace, okay, social media. These are all the places I'd certainly assume. In management, all the places I've certainly seen bias also. So part of our conversation today is about bias. So last question I'm going to ask you in Mentimeter. Make me a list of stereotypes in your neighborhood that people have of African American people. Again, it's all anonymous. You can put whatever you want to put up here. I will never know who said whatever. You can say good, bad, and the ugly things. What are some of the stereotypes in your neighborhood that people have of African American people? They're athletic. Thieves. Prone to commit crimes, untrustworthy, loud, absent fathers, lazy, uneducated criminals. Absolutely. Aggressive, uneducated. Absolutely. My community certainly has those ideas too. Don't talk about it much. Lazy, on welfare. Tall, play basketball, in gangs. That's it. There's a whole bunch of you in this room. What are those stereotypes that your community has of African Americans? Because clearly, there are probably not a lot of African Americans on this campus. Anybody know how many African Americans we have on my campus? You probably don't. We only have 450. How many students we have on my campus? 40,000 students. So there's very few, and lots of the stereotypes you're listing up here are certainly the ones that we also experience on my campus. All right, I'm going to end this. We're going to come back to this. I'm going to come back to my presentation now, and I bet you it's up here, slide 1. And I'm going to put it in presentation mode here if I can. Where's presentation mode? Top right. Up here, the dots? Okay. Present. Excellent, thank you. All right, so you're looking at an image here, and again, it's an image of bias. Tell me what's wrong with that. Tell me what's wrong in that situation. What's wrong with this professor? Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Okay. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. Well, we're going to do this real quick. Okay. Yeah. The monkey will have an advantage. I'll also repeat them all so people can hear. The monkey will have an advantage because the monkey can climb the tree fastest, right? The fish can't, right? So what we see here, of course, is professors, like myself, making assumptions about how we give exams. We always like to think we're creating a level playing field, and the reality is we're not. If you want to think about the various ways of learning people have, if you want to think about the various ways in which people are tested, it's oftentimes pretty linear. On my campus, I have 125 students in one of my classes. I have 2 ways of testing them, multiple choice questions and give them a research paper. So I do both. Many of my colleagues don't do that. They only give them a multiple choice question. So you can imagine that only tests one aspect of some students' ability to actually do well on campus. So I want you to think about the ways in which bias is set up, and we often think that it's actually being fair to everybody, and it's actually not being fair to everybody. So today then, my presentation is going to be about bias, what bias is, what are bias stereotypes, how bias shows up in our history and our culture in the United States around African Americans in particular, and I want to demonstrate how bias is set up in our public policy, because again, you've heard that I'm a public policy person, And if we have time, I'll end off with some poetry from Maya Angelou. Most of you have probably never heard of her. Hopefully some of you have, and we'll have her tell us something. So what is bias? So bias is then, I'm going to go through some of these pretty fast because I only have 45 minutes and I've got a lot of slides. So bias, and if you have any questions, put your hands up. If you have comments, put your hands up and I will acknowledge you, and then we can get the mic over to you as we move along. So there's bias then is a tendency or a preference towards a certain perspective, ideology, or a result. And bias then tends to interfere with our ability to be impartial. And there are actually two types of bias, implicit and explicit biases. So let me just talk about each one of those now. So explicit bias then are those biases that are expressed directly to somebody. You're often aware of these biases. It operates on a conscious level, and it could be something like, I like white folks and I don't like Latino folks, right? It's a conscious, explicit bias. Now the more dangerous, we would say, biases is called explicit biases. And those are the ones that are deep in our cognitive thinking process. They're often expressed indirectly. We're often unaware of them, and it operates subconsciously. So for example, if you decide that you get on a bus, for instance, you see some Latino people in the bus, you decide, I feel those dangerous people. I need to go and sit away from those people. So you are implicitly biased against them, but you unfortunately don't realize why you're doing certain things to avoid those kind of people. Okay, so keep that in mind. Explicit, implicit. I'm going to go through now how we learn explicit and implicit bias. So if you look up here at this diagram, and unfortunately it's hard to see in this light, but you can see basically an iceberg. Okay, I don't know if you can actually see it, but there's actually an iceberg there. And I want you to think about explicit bias as the top of the iceberg, right? Thank you. Explicit bias is as the top of the iceberg up here. It's what we can see. But unconscious bias, which is implicit bias, is the stuff that's below the surface. And again, if you think about the Titanic, remember you saw the ship going towards the iceberg and it could only see a small thing? Well, there was a huge thing below the surface. That's the same way implicit bias actually functions. It's attitudes, stereotypes that affect your understanding, and oftentimes happens to us in an unconscious way. So we can have, implicit biases against women. We can have implicit biases against people of color. We can have implicit biases against certain nations, certain cultures, right? So I want you to think about that. So I also want you to think about, on a personal level, how our personal biases actually play out. So our personal experiences come from our upbringing, comes from likely our family, living arrangements, family structures, our parents, our uncles, our aunts, grandparents. All those tend to shape what we consider as normal, where we live. We also process information through the media. And we process information through our education system. So when a lot of people hear the word critical race thinking or critical race theory, there's now a knee-jerk reaction to it. People think that, all of a sudden I'm going to be indoctrinated into something. Well, again, by the end of this presentation, hopefully you'll start having a bit more better nuanced understanding of critical race theory, because that's what I teach. So stereotypes then, within that, are things that we learn. And we learn stereotypes through these various elements. Our friends, our families, as we said, the media, politics. We have differences, clearly differences physically. We have differences in terms of our genders, our sexual identities. All those are different, and ultimately we learn, in many respects, some of our ideas about those groups based on not even knowing them. We actually don't even know them, but we've developed these ideas about them. And of course, we certainly have certain personal experiences also. I'm not dismissing those. And of course, we have something called human nature. And human nature is always designed to be afraid of things we're not familiar with. And so all those become factors that shape our implicit and explicit biases. So cognitive bias then is our unconscious thought patterns that essentially are deep within our minds, shaped by the socialization of ourselves, and oftentimes we confer in our cognitive bias advantages to some and disadvantages to others. And so if you want to think about our culture and our society itself, it actually has created an entire substructure, and we often refer to this as the structural elements of bias. It's built into our institutions, in the ways we have laws and rules, in the ways in which we have policies. Those are, unfortunately, all have built into them a historical, institutional biases that advantage some and disadvantage others. And it oftentimes, for some of us, is actually unconsciously happening, and yet we don't necessarily take it into consideration. So we now need to think about our brain and how our brain functions to create these biases. Okay, so I want you to think about an analogy. And the analogy I like to draw is, how many people here drive cars? Okay, great, most of us do. When you're driving your car at a slow speed down the road, do you start noticing all the things that are happening on the street side, on both sides of your driving view? The faster the car goes, the more likely it is the brain has actually turned off those details that are happening all around you, and you're essentially whipping through the streets. And so you don't now recognize the guy who was standing on the corner with his bike, and you don't necessarily understand your brain doesn't want to comprehend that. It's too much details for it. It's the same thing that happens, unfortunately, as we process information. So our brain processes about 11 million bits of information per second. So your brain is trying to essentially create shortcuts to processing information. It's the same thing it's trying to do when you're driving a car. It's processing information very quickly. And so you imagine now if your brain has to process every single thing you do, from walking through that door through where you're going to sit, it eventually develops shortcuts. So it's one of the reasons why, for example, many of you have a certain place you like to go to sit all the time, right? You come into a class and you just go to that place because your brain doesn't want to process. Why am I not sitting here? Why am I sitting there, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I want you to think about your brain as something that takes mental shortcuts to try to get to an analysis of a situation or a circumstance. And here's where we start making mistakes, because we actually now start having something called our primitive brain versus our more developed cognitive brain, which we also have. We have them both playing out at the same time. And so what unfortunately starts happening to us when we get to a situation, and it actually makes sense, right, in terms of nature designing this into our brains, we have to figure out a situation pretty quickly. So that in order for us to figure out the situation very quickly, that the stove is hot, that the fire over there, I need to avoid it, or that something over here is happening, I need to avoid that. So your brain has to figure out a shortcut how to get there, to know that that's a danger. And so once again, if you want to think about this then, if your brain is filling in gaps and figuring out who are in groups and who are out groups, primarily because it's always had those as in groups and out groups, then it becomes a situation where your brain essentially is on autopilot sometimes. And that's where cognitive bias starts to play out, when your brain gets to autopilot, and all of us do that. I'm not pointing out each person and saying, you're on autopilot and I'm not. No, I'm saying all of us do that. And we have to figure out situations fairly quickly, and that's where our brain can potentially lead us into sometimes making bad decisions, right? Based on an initial snapshot version, the brain essentially has decided what's going to be safe, what's not going to be safe, where I should go, where I shouldn't go, fight or flight. I'm going to draw your attention to this infographic here. And normally I have students look up a lot of things, but given the time we only have 45 minutes, we can actually, I'll cut some corners here. There was a mayor named Rudy Giuliani. Anybody remember Rudy Giuliani's name? Great. So Rudy Giuliani comes to become the mayor of New York City a couple decades ago, and he decides the crime rate in New York is really high. So he develops a policy called stop and frisk. Stop and frisk is a policy, I would normally have you look this up, and he also develops a policy called broken glasses. And those two policies basically give the police all kinds of latitude in terms of who they can stop, and essentially, without any kind of evidence, put you against the wall and actually frisk you to determine if you have a weapon or if you're any kind of danger to the police. Similarly, the police could actually, if you were found throwing a rock at a window and it breaks, they could essentially process you as a criminal, right? So that's the gist of the, so basically he wanted police to become very hard on crime. So once again, if you take a look at these infographics, what you'll see here is the number of stops and frisks that police were doing in 2009. So let's take a look at this one here first, which is the first infographic, which shows us that the number of police stopping individuals by race, it ended up being 53% of the stops were African Americans, 31% were Latinos, and 9% were whites. When you actually looked, though, at the proportion of the New York itself, what representative races there are in New York City, you realize then that New York City actually has 47% whites, 26% African Americans, and 27% Latinos. So right away, your math brain should tell you that twice as many African Americans are being stopped, and just a small proportion of white New Yorkers are ever being stopped. So when we started to analyze the data, what it started showing is that of the total number of people that are being stopped, only about 12% of people, of the 100%, were actually carrying something or doing something illegal. So you can see that the policy itself didn't work, but it was based primarily on police officers' cognitive bias against criminals. They actually had created this idea in their mind that the criminals were actually black. So therefore, let's go after the black guys and women, and let's stop and frisk them. Okay, so again, I want you to see how bias, prejudgment can actually influence a policy, and unfortunately, it ends up being a situation where African Americans find themselves overly policed. Cognitive biases also are taking place in terms of when people even apply for jobs. And normally this is actually works as a slide, but okay, well, let's go with this. Because we have the ideology in our society today that if you just pull up your bootstraps, you work hard, everybody has equal opportunities and you can all make it, right? If you just work hard. And the reality is what we start to see in many studies is that when people, for example, go to try and find accommodation, just rental accommodation, there's oftentimes a process by which the landlord will oftentimes see people of color show up to rent a place and say, sorry, the place is now rented. There's no more room here. It was advertised, but someone came along this afternoon and took the place. Similarly, we also see lots of evidence of where people go and apply for jobs, and even on their resume, you actually find that the resumes themselves, just the first name on the resume, can actually affect if the person gets a callback. And that is well documented in terms of various just names of people, and how they've done those tests, of course, is having matched people with resumes, just changing the names, and you'll see a disproportionate number of those people who actually have, let's call it European, white European Christian names, tend to get more callbacks than if your name is Lakeisha, or if your name is Farouk, or if your name is Juan. Those resumes, although they're matched exactly the same, they don't get necessarily the callback to say, hey, we want to consider you for a job interview, not even the job, just the interview, right? So oftentimes, cognitive bias is playing out just in the very process of people applying for jobs. So I want you to think about race today in the United States, affects, and normally we'd look these up, life chances, where you live, how you're treated, your access to power, prestige, and opportunities, your access to education, housing, and other valued resources. But most importantly, here in the United States, race actually affects your life expectancy. So now I'm going to ask you to go and look something up for me. What's the life expectancy of a white Euro-American male in the United States today? What's the life expectancy of a white Euro-American male in the United States today? On average. And again, I want you to think about this also varying by location in the United States, but let's just go with the first average. What's the average? Anybody find that number? Quickly? What'd you find? 78, thank you. What's the life expectancy of an African American male here in the United States? So we got 78. African American male is what? What number can you find? I'm asking you to Google this, right? 72. So you've got now 6 years less. Now let's look up Native American person, Native American male in the United States. What's the life expectancy of that individual? Okay, so what would you rather be in the United States? Okay, so this is one of the indicators. Health access is an indicator. There are many other indicators. And again, we can go into that more, but unfortunately we don't have the time, but let's keep going. So I want you to now think about where some of these ideas and opportunities structures have actually come to us in our situation today. And again, I'm now going to switch the presentation over now to talk about race. And I'm going to use this case study now to try to demonstrate opportunity structures in the United States. So the historical treatment of race has often been linked to a so-called pseudoscience. So I want you all to take a look at that infographic that's in front of you. It's actually not even an infographic. It actually comes right out of a history textbook. Okay? What's the pattern you notice right away in the images that came right out of a history textbook? Yeah. Thank you. So the darker skin tones are at the very bottom. Okay. What's also glaring about this? They're all male. Thank you. They're all men, right? So clearly back then, women didn't matter. So let's look at the hierarchy here. And so what you see here is the darker skin groups are at the very bottom, and if it all leads to a pyramid, towards, if you want to think about a pyramid, think about the way in which it leads up to the one Anglo-Saxon male. And so I want you to imagine then that race became the norm. On my campus, I like to teach this because we have something called the Linus Pauling Institution. And Linus Pauling was a person who actually followed this logic, because this was the logic of the time. This was being taught at school. You're being tested on this, these hierarchies. You're being tested on this, I usually use the word white supremacy notion of the world. And that's, if you didn't pass those tests, you didn't get your degree, right? So you had to basically ingest the idea that Europeans basically became the group that was at the apex. They were the apex group. And as a result of that, their being the apex group was actually a natural occurrence. Nature designed it that way. They were the group that was the smartest, the more civilized, the ones that had creative things. They're the ones who actually did all the good things in the world. That's, unfortunately, that was what we were being taught. So if you want to think about even anthropology textbooks and geography textbooks and science books of the nature in this time period, all had these ideas deeply created and ingrained in the terms of the students. And so again, I'm not going to go through all these, but ultimately they would measure various body parts to look for difference. Cranial level, height, weight, stature, type of hair texture, nose structure. All those became important markers for, at the time, of differentiating between races, and oftentimes then also creating the civilized versus the uncivilized groups. And then that sort of became a justification then for oppression. It's okay to oppress those groups because those groups are actually inferior to us. And again, I want you to think about how we treat Native Americans today, and even in the past. They were an inferior group, ipso facto. It was okay for us to commit a genocide against them, to put them on reservations, to marginalize them. That was all part of a logic that they were actually in this hierarchy that essentially puts them at the very bottom. And so this notion of a white supremacy ideology really plays out in our unconsciousness. It becomes part of our unconscious bias, even today, because those ideas are still in the DNA of our thinking. And I want you to think about that deeply. In the DNA of our thinking. How could that be? I'm a just person, I'm a religious person, I'm a good person, but yet some of those ideas are still in my unconsciousness. I'll tell you they're in my unconsciousness. I'll give you a bit of background on myself. I grew up in Canada, was born in the Caribbean, Trinidad particularly, migrated to Canada, and when I'm thinking about anti-blackness and white supremacy, it's what my parents taught me. Why did they teach that to me? Because that's how they grew up. They grew up in a culture where whiteness was connected to kindness, to civility, to the highest apex group in the Caribbean. And so, ipso facto, my parents also became white supremacists in their way. And they, of course, taught that to my sister and myself. And again, I've had to, over the years, essentially deprogram myself, because that's unfortunately the culture which I grew up in. And so again, when I think about this idea of history and some of the outrageous things that took place, they were taking place primarily because there was a notion at the time of the superiority of one group over other groups, and therefore it was justified that you could actually go ahead and conduct campaigns of genocide, campaigns of enslavement, campaigns of hegemony and or imperialism against whole other cultures, because those other cultures were considered as less than the dominant European group. And so let's now talk a little bit about African Americans. I'm going to now use African Americans as my case study, as my time is coming down to 15 minutes. So when you think about African Americans, this is a group that arrived in 1619 in the United States. They arrived essentially as individuals who are going to become the industrial engine of American economy. Why? Primarily because the US economy was based on an agricultural production. And you needed bodies, people, to actually work the land because there was no mechanization, because you're now starting to grow something called cotton. You're growing tobacco, you're growing rice, and you were growing other agricultural products for export. And if you needed a workforce that could be with you for the rest of your life, in other words, you could exploit them for the entire life of them, then you'd need to have that body of people that were now your possession. So this is unfortunately how African Americans became part of a slavery, part of a slave economy in the United States. And so you needed to essentially then create the proverbial other. You need to create the idea that these were inhuman people. They're not human beings, therefore you could actually exploit them. And so when you think about this, what kind of stereotypes would you need? Remember we listed off stereotypes? Well, here are some of the other stereotypes. African American bodies were beasts, not humans. They were savages. They didn't feel pain like the rest of us, right? So therefore, when you had African Americans, they were treated by veterinarians. They weren't treated by doctors. You had African Americans who didn't necessarily be seen as being responsible. They were often seen as irresponsible people, sexually voracious, dimwits, violent, childlike, but in need of white leadership and paternalism. So if you have those kinds of ideas, then it's very easy for you to enslave people and do really bad things to them. Other ones that certainly came up, they were lustful. They were ignorant, childlike, inferior, devilish, villainous, powerful bodies. They don't feel pain, right? So these are a whole bunch of, again, I'm going to use the word stereotypes, but they were value systems that actually were deeply ingrained in society that actually looked at black bodies and essentially assumed these were the characteristics that they had. So I also want you to think about this as having a global presence also. So it wasn't only in the United States. This was going on in the Caribbean. This was going on in Africa itself as the continent. And ultimately, these became the justifications for a lot of white folks thinking that they were actually ordained by God to actually be the ones on the apex, on the top, and they were going to be the ones who were considered as intelligent, hardworking, natural leaders, conservative, ambitious, attractive, benevolent. All these became adjectives that were often attached to white folks in complete opposite to people of color. And as a result of that, you certainly had a justification for domination of other groups. So anti-blackness then becomes a phenomena that exists and is deeply rooted in our unconsciousness today. And again, coming back to cognitive bias, right? This is where the cognitive bias parts comes in. So blackness then becomes something that is the other. It's something we don't even actually know about, because many of us only know black folks through the media, or through a friend of a friend, or through what we have. And I often like to talk to my students about when they first were aware of blackness, was oftentimes they were driving through a part of the United States, and their parents said, lock the doors, wind up the windows. We're going through a bad area. And so as a young child, you're looking around in the car, obviously, and you're starting to think, what do they mean by bad area? Well, then all of a sudden you start seeing African-American people on the corners, waiting for buses, doing their natural thing, and the child now starts making the cognitive bias connection between blackness and wickedness and essentially not being people that are trustworthy. So again, I want you to also think about how this anti-blackness also manifests itself in our public policy here in the United States. And this infographic here really demonstrates that. So if you take a look at the infographic on the bottom, it's It's like a Monopoly game. And what you see here in the Monopoly game is that people like to erase the fact that African Americans have had to go through slavery, Jim Crow laws, eventually segregation, all these various elements in the public policy that they've had to circumvent to actually get to the end point, which is success in the United States, the American dream. And unfortunately for white folks who often don't realize that their trajectory has been much more linear, not full of public policy and not full of things that were actually designed to essentially trip them up at any opportunity that could be created within the system itself. And so I now want to just talk very quickly about some of the stereotypes that existed, and normally I'd go through some of these, but I'm not going to have time. So what you start seeing after slavery ends, and even during slavery, is a number of images of African American people. Some of these images are really ugly, but they still exist in the unconsciousness, and that is black folks are great singers, dancers, musicians. Again, they're connected to music. They're oftentimes also connected to the idea of violence against white women. And again, I want you to think about that, because if you go ahead and realize that this is one of the reasons why a lot of black men got lynched in the post-slavery period, was because there was an allegation of them disrespecting a white female. Okay. African Americans are typically dehumanized in terms of the way in which they're represented. They're represented in toys and games and all kinds of popular culture. And the most important thing was the actual aspect of lynching black folks. That was a real terroristic kind of opportunity for developing a real Sunday afternoon picnic. People would go out and actually spend time having a picnic, and the culmination of the picnic was to actually go and lynch a black man, right? And again, we can go into that. That's a whole other history of the United States. More present day, of course, we've certainly had a president who was African American, so people have often said, oh, we've now reached a new pinnacle of tolerance. We clearly have African American people now in the White House. We certainly had Kamala Harris, who almost became the president of the United States. She was the vice president, first black woman, first woman, and then of course we had the first president who was African American. But I also want you to recognize too that despite of those people getting into power, there was still stereotypes attached to them and cognitive biases attached to them. And here we could go ahead and deconstruct these images, but we won't have time for that. But ultimately, this is Barack Obama and his wife pre-election in 2008. And what you see here, of course, is you see a lot of things happening in this. You see Saddam Hussein is portrayed in the portrait above the fireplace, the American flag's burning. You have Barack Obama dressed as clearly a Muslim or somebody who is a foreigner, and you have Michelle Obama dressed like Angela Davis, in a sense, a radical black female with big hair and so forth. So again, I want you to think about how some of these images came to shape how Americans regarded black folks, but more specifically a person who would potentially become president of the United States. So in Kamala Harris's campaign, just finished, these were doctored images, but ultimately a sexualized image of a black woman was very common in this time period, often referred to as a Jezebel, somebody who's actually sexually voracious. I'm 99.999% sure Kamala Harris was never using lingerie, but unfortunately someone decided to create that sexualized image of her for portrayal. In contrast, of course, to Melania Trump, who's clearly seen as being the person who is the archetype of a first lady. Actually, in talking about that, let's go ahead and Google Melania Trump model, so as an image. So Melania Trump as a model, images. What images come up for you? Melania Trump, model, images. What do you see? And those aren't doctored images. This is Melania Trump in the mid-90s as a individual. What do you see? She's in her underwear. Absolutely, wearing lingerie. She's actually the one wearing lingerie. She's also the one who posed in many magazines that were clearly sexually voracious. Okay, so again, I want you to think about projection here. And then one more image I want to share with you here is the welfare queen. This is an image that clearly has been connected and associated with black women. And the reality is when you go and look at the policy of the 1970s, yes, there was somebody who Ronald Reagan connected to being a person who was ripping off the welfare system. But I guarantee you go and try and rip off the welfare system now, you are in big trouble because there's so many checks and balances built into it that it's really hard to rip it off. What is the average monthly SNAP benefit? Anybody know what that number is? A monthly SNAP benefit? What's that total number? I think it's actually higher. I think it's like 184 to 190. Okay? So you have a lot of answers to questions, which is good. I find the person in my class, and I always go to them. But other folks can look these things up because we're not making these things up, right? So it's about $190 per month per family. So think about how far $190 worth of money will go to buying groceries. Not very far, okay? So again, I want you to think about this whole idea of the image of the welfare queen. Even today, we have the image of the black male who is actually a thug, a menace to a society, thief. We have the image of George Floyd here. I hope you all remember George Floyd. George Floyd's murder by that heinous police officer. And again, I want you to think about where that image comes from. It comes right out of the slavery experience, right to the present. Okay, now I'm going to now end off the presentation with a couple of examples with you about policy and how public policy has essentially tried to now remove black people's rights and any gains they've made over the last 150 years. Some of you may know this or may not know this, but there was actually a development of an AP class, which is a high school class that teaches about African American history. And in the last 2 years, there's been a great attempt to diminish that class, to take it out of the AP system. It still does exist in the AP system, but 2 states, Florida and Texas, have removed it. And they've actually sanitized it. In other words, they've said, well, slavery wasn't so bad after all. You know, all sorts of historical moments in African American history have been essentially, I'm going to use the word whitewashed. They've also had an attempt to try to make those curriculum, again, sanitized. You were probably all aware of this. This is certainly happening on many campuses. I've heard Eastern Oregon University is certainly having this, where there's been an erasure of DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So again, that directly goes towards African Americans in terms of an aim, in terms of federal policy, to try and disentangle or remove or take out any programs that would have affected black folks. And again, there's a whole history of anti-blackness. They want to get rid of all that. I mentioned SNAP. SNAP program has a lot of black folks on the SNAP program. They're not the only ethnic group on there. Again, if you go and look it up by race, actually please go ahead and look up who uses SNAP programs by race. You'll see that, yes, African Americans and Latinos disproportionately to their population use SNAP, but they're not the only group that's using it. And so that program has certainly been put in place now to essentially underfund it, and I would argue it's the attempt is to try to get it out of the books altogether. And of course, anybody find out? Did you look it up? Exactly. Okay. Another way of taking back black folks' rights, 1965 is the watershed year for the Voters' Rights Act, which actually gave African Americans the right to vote, finally in the United States on an equal level. You didn't have poll taxes anymore. You didn't have taxes or cognitive ability tests, et cetera. But nonetheless, since 1965, there's been a widespread attempt to do something called redistricting, to remove the black voice or the black vote, and that's going on right now. You can see it happening. It just happened in Texas. As a result of that, California just passed Prop 150 to try to essentially compensate for the lack of seats that were going to be available in Texas for the Congress. And of course, one of the most egregious one that's happening right as we speak today is the removal of the American Affordable Care Act. I say the Affordable American Care Act because that's been a policy that's been labeled as the Obamacare. And again, let's go ahead and look up who actually is likely to be beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act in terms of even states or even races. And what you'll see, of course, is that lower income white folks who are in the United States are more likely to be the ones who benefit from that particular policy. And unfortunately, we're about to see that policy go away. And if that goes away, there's going to be a lot of people without health care in the United States. Last two policies, tariff policy here in the United States has certainly been put in place, and it's disproportionately affected black people once again because they oftentimes are shopping in low-cost stores, which are oftentimes bringing in goods from places like China, and that includes Walmart, it includes Target and so forth, and those stores are being hit the hardest in terms of taxation through tariffs. And then finally, African American people have certainly been subjected to more new forms of racism, which can include modern racism, which I often refer to, and others have referred to this as micro-invalidations, micro-assaults, and micro-insults. That's a constant. That's in their lives all the time. And you'll see from this infographic here that most African American people, about 75% in total, will tell you that yes, at some point, not so long ago, they've actually been the victims of some sort of racial discrimination. So finally, I want to just end off by thinking about what just took place in the last couple of weeks. The No Kings rally. It was often blamed on African Americans, Antifa, and so forth. I went to the rallies. Those rallies had a diverse set of people. Old, mainly, and young, but mainly white folks. And then finally, the other side of this, of course, is the other insurrection that took place January 6, 2021. That was considered as actually a friendly walk in the park. People were just there to protest, and that was certainly not a nonviolent activity. Finally, we still live in two Americas, a white America and an African American America. When you look at neighborhoods today, you realize they have not become desegregated. They've become as segregated as they were back in the 1980s. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this, and I'm going to suggest to you that you actually go after this test to test your own implicit bias called the Harvard. You can write this down, the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. See how biased you really are. Harvard creates this online test. And then finally, we're going to end off with this, with Q&A. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
I think we have about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Or
Yeah,
thereabouts?
we do. We have about 10 minutes. And I know some people might have a class at 11. If you have to, just go ahead and go out the back. Otherwise, let's open it up for questions.
So today we're taking questions, comments, and we're taking drama today too. So if you have any drama, we're taking drama.
You're a better one than I am.
All right. Ask anything you want. I don't. Great. We have a question, or comment, or maybe drama.
Recently, I've been reading a lot of literature in her class, actually.
In her class?
and-
No. Okay.
And I had read this thing that's saying it's people who are oppressed constantly are exhausted because we are constantly educating our oppressors.
Sure.
And I feel like I face this because I'm a Latino woman, and I'm always like, really upset about everything and trying to educate people who, are the oppressors. And so I'm just like really conflicted right now because I feel like I face that every day where I'm like constantly trying to educate people who are uneducated and don't see their white privilege, don't see implicit and explicit bias, and how systematic racism is so deeply ingrained in our society and how it's so hurtful. So I'm like exhausted. Like I don't know what to do like as a person to like see hope in the world and like everything that's going on.
Right. I hear you. I hear the same thing from my colleagues and friends because we're clearly in a historical moment now where it just feels that every time we turn on another day, there's a new something happening to people of color, women, sexual minorities, etc. And so we need to realize then that what we have to do, I've told people, is surround yourself with people like yourself, right, for the next couple of years. In other words, that's the only way we're going to get through this. Volleyball team, good luck. All right, good luck. Have a great day. Thank you for coming. So we have to definitely put ourselves in that situation where we find commonality and strength within ourselves. You remember, and I'm going to play this at the very end, Maya Angelou is going to talk about a poem. Anybody ever heard the poem called Still I Rise? Okay, a couple of us have heard it. And that's actually the piece of inspiration I take from. So no matter what they've done to us, we have to find the strength to still continue to rise. Because history is on our side, right? And history will always be on our side in the sense of how things will actually unfold. Yeah. Other questions or comments, thoughts? Hey, thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you for coming. Okay, have a great day. Questions, thoughts? Oh, good. We have another question or thought.
You
Hey, how are you?
mentioned
Yes.
you had to unlearn kind of your
Oh, yeah. White
learned
supremacy? I had to unlearn
white
that.
supremacy. Yeah,
Mhm.
like of course this is probably it's hard to maybe sum up in a few words, but what did that maybe look like for you?
Okay, for me, I'll talk about my white supremacy and also my anti-queerness, and also I had to unlearn my sexism, right? Because those are all taught to me in intersecting ways, right? So it's not only the anti-blackness. So how I did it was going through university and taking classes like Dr. Puentes and other mentors that I had that actually exposed me to books and films, and also then had the courage then to go and be in spaces that I was not necessarily the dominant person. So again, when I first was growing up, I was very, very anti-queer. I would call people all sorts of names. I had to then find friends when I finally got to university who were actually LGBTQ. And then putting myself in those spaces with them to actually listen to them and actually find respect for them that's how I actually got to a better place. I'm not perfect. I will never be perfect. That stuff that I talked about is still deeply ingrained in the back of my head. And it easily comes out when I least expect it, you know, about some of my values or some of my ways of looking at the world. And so I have to always be aware of that. Think about it. I always like to think about it in the analogy of, you know, breathing bad air. Like you've spent a whole lifetime breathing bad air, and that has an effect of actually making you sick. But it's a sickness you don't recognize you have. And it takes you intentional steps to actually rid yourself of that pathogen. That's what I'll say. Yeah, thank you. And so black folks can be some of the most racist people against other black folks. You know, queer folks can be the most rabid against other queer folk. And women can certainly be the most rabid against other women when it comes to, you know, other women's rights. You know, we've seen that with the killing of Roe versus Wade. I mean, that's been a good example of where women have actually come out and said this is actually a good thing. You know, taking away the rights of other women. Other questions, comments, thoughts? You have a question. I can see it. Go for it. Let's have a comment.
So you mentioned about like first names, right? And then I noticed that, so I come from a family of 7, or like I have older siblings, and I noticed, okay, little background.
Sure.
I'm from Palau. It's a
Nice.
small Pacific island in the Pacific. And my siblings are named with like some of the common names, like Irene.
Okay, Christian names.
Yes. And I always wonder, I'm like, why did my parents name them? And I was the only one who came with, they named me with my dad's initials.
Okay.
I smell like fruit. It's
Okay,
it's my perfume.
No, I see that. I get you.
So, can you help me shoot a fly? Anyway, so I noticed when I came here, I've been trying to apply for jobs, and
Yes.
it's been really hard. I have a friend, and we're both Palauans, but then his last name is also like, I don't know, it's,
European?
yes, I don't want to give too much information. And he just moved here to the States, and I'm a senior. I have experience, and I'm much, much older than him, and I've been around a lot, like, I mean, by like work-wise. And he got the job, he got the call, and I didn't. So I'm like, it must be, I'm really getting a lot of attention. But it wasn't here when you were talking. I don't know why it came here to me while I'm talking. But anyways, yeah, that's just my comment
Yeah.
on the names. And I'm over here like listing down names from my families, and they're pretty much like they live here in the States.
Yeah.
They can get jobs because of their names. And I'm the only one who doesn't have like a European name. I just have CJ and my ancestral name.
Okay.
So that's something that kind of stuck out to me.
Well, thanks for saying that, because it is a phenomena that exists in the United States, Canada, and Europe, where people with ethnic names, whatever they are, often find themselves screened out for jobs at the initial point of where they submit the resumes, right? Because most people submit a resume before you actually even get the job, and that's the first form of screening. And the unconscious bias, of course, for the people who are actually doing the screening is that they look at a name and they make an assumption about the individual. And that's where the bias comes in. So we actually do anti-bias training at my university, and maybe you do it here at Eastern Oregon University also, where hiring committees are taught intentionally that we have these biases that we need to be aware of even before we get the first applications coming in. So a bias could be against names, it could be against gender, it could be against age, it could be against just background in terms of what people do research on. So, you know, if you do research on LGBTQ issues, for example, then that could be something that triggers somebody who's reading your application to decide whether you get shortlisted or not, right? So all of these things need to be taught to people that we actually have these biases, and that's the unfortunate part. We're not quite there in terms of our society, because we do this for resumes, we do this for jobs, for even apartments. When you go to, you know, rent an apartment, we do this in all different areas that we don't necessarily conscious we're doing it. So thank you for asking.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for coming. I have a lot of students from Samoa. We have a whole South Pacific Island set of students in my university, and I work with a lot of them.
Yeah,
Any other questions, comments? I think we probably have a couple more. 3 minutes left.
oh, here we go.
Oh, good. Right next to you. Hi.
So we talked about explicit and implicit bias in my
Yeah.
communication class.
Good.
And I find like an implicit bias that I have is when I enter a room like this, as a Pacific Islander, I feel like I have to kind of code switch to be like less Islander, I guess. Like this is not how I usually talk.
I hear
Like,
you.
This accent, like it's so, and I find that it's so draining. Like when I get home, at the end of the day, like I don't have the energy to socialize anymore because I feel like I put so much effort in day-to-day conversations.
Right, right. You're hitting on a point that W.E.B. Du Bois talks about, something called the double consciousness. So people of color have to have a double consciousness. Both the consciousness, now it's trying to attack me now. The consciousness of both them for their own culture and have to understand the culture of the oppressor, right? Because that's the way we actually survive in this world, is to actually understand the culture of the oppressor better than the oppressor understands us. So I want you to think about this as a way of thinking about it. Do men know more about women, or do women know more about men in terms of how they operate? Women know much more about men than men know about women, right? And again, that's a phenomena that women have to know that, because that's how they survive. If they did not know what triggers a man, what makes him happy or sad, then women would find themselves in a dark place. And so it's the same thing with people of color. We have to know much more about white American people than they will ever want to even have the privilege, well, not even privilege, they even want to know about us. So knowing that, you are in a world, and I'm in the same world, where I have to know when I'm in rooms where I'm actually working with my colleagues, I constantly have to code switch, constantly. And I've been in the game for 27 years, and it hasn't changed at all. And I'm sure Professor Puentes has to do the same thing.
Yeah. I often tell my students, if you see me out, I'm probably in sweatpants or something uncomfortable and not dressed nicely. And even though we're here at Eastern Oregon and we all wear jeans anyways, right?
No, I hear you, because we're often judged by what we're looking like before. I've got some colleagues of mine who can show up teaching summer school wearing shorts, Hawaiian shirts, and whatever, and they're white males who are older. That never appears on their evaluations, that this person showed up with shorts, flip-flops, and a Hawaiian shirt. On my evaluation, if I'm not dressed in a certain way, he looks like a bum. You know, he looks like he's not professional. Does he have a degree? should he even be teaching me? I had that throughout my career.
Well, I want to thank everyone so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much for coming out and talk to us a little bit more about these issues and topics. There's probably a few minutes if anybody wants to have
Yeah,
a one-on-one
I'm still here.
conversation, but I think our presentation for today is over. So thank you to all the classes that were able to come and people that came
And thank you to our
support.
AV person over here in the
Yes,
back
thank
of the
you,
room.
Cody.
Thank you. Yeah, you kept it live. All right, I'm still willing to stick around. I have no agenda for today. I'm going to enjoy your city today.